You're a human infant. You can't walk. You can't talk. You can't feed yourself. Your body can't even keep its own temperature steady. You have zero awareness of what a predator is, but predators know exactly what you are. You tip the scales at roughly 3 kilograms. Bluntly put, you're a walking, breathing emergency waiting to happen. And yet, somehow, you have a lineage. Thousands of generations stretching back. Which means that at some point, an unbroken chain of early humans figured out how to keep something this fragile alive. Not for a day, not for a week, but long enough to keep producing more babies, generation after generation, for 300,000 years straight. So this isn't just a curious question, it's deeply personal. If even a single one of your ancestors had dropped the ball just once, you simply wouldn't exist to watch this. That's an unsettling thought. But here's the fascinating twist, figuring out how our ancestors kept their kids alive isn't just a rundown of old survival hacks. It's a glimpse into some of the most advanced social cooperation that's ever evolved on Earth. Behavior most people never stop to consider, behavior we've largely let go of in modern life, and arguably, behavior we're now paying a price for having abandoned. Let's start with a question almost nobody bothers to ask: why is human childbirth so brutal compared to other species? Most animals hit the ground running, quite literally. A newborn giraffe falls nearly 2 meters, lands, and is trotting around within the hour. A foal is up on its legs in under 2 hours. Even chimpanzees, our nearest relatives, can grip onto their mothers almost immediately. Humans. Not even close. A human newborn is helpless for months on end, utterly reliant on others for absolutely everything. This isn't an accident or some evolutionary mistake, it's a deliberate trade-off, and it even has a name: secondary altriciality. Human infants arrive earlier in their development, relatively speaking, than almost any other primate, and the reason traces back to the brain. Human brains are massive, not just compared to other species, but compared to what our own bodies can structurally handle. If a baby's brain were to reach full development before birth, the skull simply wouldn't fit through the birth canal. So evolution found a workaround that's equal parts clever and unsettling: it made us deliver early. At birth, a baby's brain is only about a quarter of its eventual adult size, compared to roughly 45% for a newborn chimp. That means a massive chunk of brain development, the kind other species finish in weeks or months, takes us years, and all of it unfolds outside the womb, fully exposed. This is sometimes referred to as the obstetric dilemma, and it points to something essential: a human baby cannot survive on its own, not even briefly, not even in theory. Our species literally cannot reproduce successfully without a support network. And that reframes the entire question. How did ancient humans keep their kids alive isn't really about individual competence, it's about group behavior, social architecture, and the way communities were structured. You've probably heard the saying, "It takes a village to raise a child." At this point it's practically a greeting card cliché, printed on mugs, said at baby showers. But here's what most people miss: in the context of human evolution, this wasn't a metaphor at all. It was a literal survival strategy. Effective enough that many anthropologists think it's one of the key reasons Homo sapiens outlasted every other hominin species on the planet. This idea is known as cooperative breeding, and the logic runs like this: in most primate species, raising offspring falls almost entirely on the mother. Humans broke that mold completely. Throughout the vast majority of our evolutionary history, life as hunter-gatherers, childcare wasn't a solo job or even a two-person job. It was spread across the entire group. Grandmothers, in particular, played an outsized role, so much so that there's an entire scientific theory built around it, aptly called the grandmother hypothesis. Anthropologist Kristen Hawkes developed this idea in the 1990s, proposing that human menopause evolved specifically so older women could stop having children of their own and instead pour their energy into helping their grandchildren survive. Sit with that for a second. Women may live decades beyond their fertile years precisely because seasoned grandmothers were so valuable to a child's odds of survival that evolution essentially traded their fertility for their caregiving. And the data backs this up. Research on traditional societies shows that having a maternal grandmother nearby measurably boosts a child's chances of survival. In some populations, it's among the single strongest predictors of whether a child makes it past age 2. And it wasn't just grandmothers. Aunts, uncles, older siblings, and even unrelated adults in the group all pitched in on childcare in ways that are rare among other primates. Young children were constantly passed from one set of arms to another, held, fed, watched, carried, by multiple adults throughout the day. Researchers studying present-day hunter-gatherer groups have found that among the Aka people of Central Africa, fathers stay within arm's reach of their infants nearly 47% of the time. A level of involvement that exceeds what we typically see from fathers in industrialized nations today. The bottom line, ancient children were wrapped in an unusually dense web of relationships, not just tethered to two parents. Now let's get into something that tends to make modern listeners squirm a little. Breastfeeding in ancient societies looked almost nothing like what we consider standard practice today. Start with duration. Among traditional cultures and our closest primate cousins, nursing commonly lasted 2 to 4 years, sometimes even longer. The World Health Organization currently advises breastfeeding through at least age 2, which surprises a lot of people, but from an evolutionary lens, weaning earlier than that would have been the unusual, even risky, choice. Then there's frequency. Mothers in hunter-gatherer communities often nursed multiple times every hour during the day. Some research suggests up to 4 times an hour in the earliest months. This wasn't just about calories. Frequent nursing also helped regulate the infant's stress levels and, critically, suppressed ovulation, naturally spacing births roughly 3 to 4 years apart. Here's where it gets more interesting still. Wet nursing, nursing a child who isn't biologically yours, seems to be ancient and shows up across virtually every culture studied. In many societies, multiple women in a community would breastfeed each other's children. This helped sick or orphaned infants survive, and it also deepened social bonds between families in ways that likely paid off in broader survival terms. Let's get practical for a second. Imagine you're a mother living during the Pleistocene. You need to forage, which might mean walking several kilometers across rough terrain each day, all while keeping a completely helpless baby alive. Let's get practical for a second. Imagine you're a mother living during the Pleistocene. You need to forage, which might mean walking several kilometers across rough terrain each day, all while keeping a completely helpless baby alive. A baby crying alone is essentially an open invitation to anything nearby with an appetite for meat. The solution our ancestors landed on was simple and is now backed by a mountain of research: constant physical contact. Carrying infants against the body, what we now call baby wearing, appears to be the default state for our species throughout most of its history. Physiologically, newborns have a powerful grasping reflex. Press a finger into their palm and they'll clamp down with surprising strength. A leftover behavior likely shaped by the need to hang on to a caregiver. Research has demonstrated that skin-to-skin contact helps regulate an infant's heart rate, breathing, temperature, and stress hormones. Babies who are carried more simply cry less, not because they're being indulged, but because being held is meeting a genuine biological requirement. Studies comparing cultures show that in societies where infants are carried throughout the day, crying rates drop dramatically, by roughly half, according to some estimates. That crying isn't a quirk of temperament, evolutionarily, it's a signal of perceived danger. Modern parenting practices, by contrast, have spent the better part of a century moving in the opposite direction: cribs, separate bedrooms, rigid schedules, sleep training. Some of it works just fine. But it's worth recognizing that, viewed historically, we're essentially running a massive, loosely controlled experiment on our own species. Eventually, babies have to move beyond milk, and this is where things get a little more colorful, and occasionally gross by today's standards. Solid food in ancient communities looked nothing like the pureed, perfectly portioned baby food on supermarket shelves now. The go-to method across countless ancient and traditional cultures for softening food was pre-mastication, an adult chewing food and then passing it directly to the infant's mouth. By modern hygiene standards, this sounds alarming, and yes, it does transfer bacteria from the adult's mouth to the baby's. But here's the twist, some of that bacteria might actually help. Research suggests infants exposed to pre-chewed food might pick up beneficial oral microbes from their caregivers, potentially giving their immune systems a boost. Worth noting, too, that chimpanzees regularly do this as well, suggesting it's an extremely old behavior, likely as old as our genus itself. Beyond that, ancient children were introduced to soft foods fairly early, calorie-dense bone marrow, mashed plants, eggs, and small bits of fish or meat. Studies of ancient dental remains even suggest that hunter-gatherer children generally had healthier teeth and better nutrition than children from early farming societies, who relied heavily on starchy grains. So yes, kids raised on a hunter-gatherer diet had fewer cavities than kids from the Bronze Age. Eating a bit of everything, it turns out, beats living on bread. Here's another thing nobody really talks about, ancient humans basically never slept alone, and this deserves its own spotlight. In virtually every hunter-gatherer society ever studied, and across the overwhelming majority of traditional cultures worldwide, infants and young children sleep pressed against an adult. Not tucked away in a separate room, not in a crib, but against another human body throughout the night. This is what's now called co-sleeping or bed sharing, and far from being some fringe modern parenting trend, it represents the default human behavior for roughly 99% of our existence as a species. Modern Western medicine raises real concerns about this, chiefly, the risk of accidental suffocation in plush bedding, especially with impaired caregivers. Those concerns are legitimate in certain modern settings. But in the conditions our ancestors actually slept in, firm surfaces, sober and attentive caregivers, cooler environments, those particular risks don't apply the same way. And the upsides of co-sleeping for infant development are well established: steadier body temperature, more regulated breathing, more frequent nighttime nursing, and notably longer breastfeeding overall. Anthropologist James McKenna, who has dedicated decades to studying infant sleep, has suggested that the rhythmic stimulation of a sleeping adult's breathing and movement may help stabilize a baby's own breathing during a stage of development when that regulation isn't yet reliable. The solo nursery is an extremely recent invention, and given how grim infant mortality statistics were for most of human history, it's a fair bet that something about the old way was actually working. For the overwhelming majority of human history, infant mortality was brutally high by today's standards. The best estimates suggest that somewhere between 30% and 50% of children in Paleolithic and early Neolithic populations died before reaching age 5. This wasn't a failure of care, it was the absence of germ theory, antibiotics, vaccines, modern nutrition science, and most of the tools that have since cut child mortality by roughly 96% since 1800. Medicinal plant use, for instance, appears to be remarkably old. Chimpanzees self-medicate using particular plants, and archaeological evidence shows deliberate herbal treatments dating back at least 50,000 years. Willow bark, the precursor to modern aspirin, has been used for pain and fever for millennia. Honey served as a wound antiseptic in ancient Egypt and probably earlier still. Garlic has real antimicrobial properties that ancient people identified through observation alone, long before they understood the underlying chemistry. Alongside practical remedies, ritual was universal. Every documented human culture developed ceremonies tied to birth and early childhood, naming rituals, protective talismans, prayers, rites of passage. The notion that ancient people were indifferent to losing children, that life was so cheap death barely registered, simply doesn't hold up against the archaeological record. They grieved deeply. They tried hard. And slowly, across thousands of years, they built up enough hard-won knowledge to gradually improve a child's odds. Now for the part of this that tends to surprise people: in several respects, what ancient humans did to protect their children worked better than what replaced it. Not everything, of course, far from it. Vaccines, sanitation, modern medicine are not up for debate. The collapse of childhood mortality over the last century stands as one of humanity's greatest achievements, full stop. But within the realm of behavioral and social care, the emotional and physical world surrounding early childhood, there's a strong case that industrialized societies dismantled systems that were quietly doing essential work, without fully grasping what they were tearing down. The extended kinship network that once spread caregiving across many adults has, in many Western countries, shrunk down to a nuclear unit, often scattered across distances, sometimes deeply isolated. Constant physical contact during the day has been replaced by bouncers, swings, and playpens, devices engineered specifically to soothe babies without anyone having to hold them. Constant physical contact during the day has been replaced by bouncers, swings, and playpens, devices engineered specifically to soothe babies without anyone having to hold them. Still, rates of postpartum depression, infant sleep struggles, and parental burnout across industrialized nations are real, well documented, and notably elevated. Stack that against the social ecosystem we actually evolved within, and the contrast is stark. The ancient answer to, how do you keep a child alive, was never, you manage it solo, or even, you manage it as a couple. It was, you do it as a group. You distribute the workload. You spread out the exhaustion. You make sure no single adult is ever the sole thing standing between a child and disaster. That's not philosophy, that's engineering. So how did our ancestors keep their children alive? They held them almost constantly. They breastfed them for years. They slept beside them every single night. They softened their food by chewing it themselves. They surrounded them with a thick mesh of attentive adults, grandmothers, aunts, uncles, friends, neighbors, all genuinely invested in that child's survival. They grieved, often, when children were lost. They worked to understand illness using the limited tools available to them. They built rituals to keep communities intact through loss. And generation after generation, they slowly accumulated knowledge, passing it down first as tradition and practice, and eventually as writing. The single thread running through all of it, consistent across every culture, every era, every region, is this: children survived when they were woven into social connection, and struggled when they were cut off from it. That's not just ancient history, it's still true now. We've built incredible technology for keeping kids physically safe. We've made enormous progress against the biological threats that once killed nearly half of all children before they reached school age, and that progress is genuinely, profoundly good. But the social infrastructure, the dense, overlapping, distributed system of human care our species spent hundreds of thousands of years building, that's the piece we're still trying to figure out how to hold on to. Ancient humans had no antibiotics. No ultrasounds. No formula, no pediatricians, no car seats. What they had was each other. And for most of what actually mattered, that turned out to be enough.